Yo, what is up, guys? Snap here. We've been getting drip fed new ascendancies about a 1 month long event that GGG is running, and I kind of wanted to do a little bit of a build update for a lot of these party builds because they're obviously going to be relevant again now that we have a new league coming out for the first time in like 8 months. However, there have been some substantial shifts to the comp that you run in 6-man, this kind of thing. So I want to make a dedicated video to all of the new technology and all of the new builds, starting with the carry, which is what we're going to talk about today. But first, I need to tell a story. So in Settler League, we did a blight strategy where we were sucking mobs into the blight pump and, getting tons of loot. It was an okay strategy, but it was a little bit boring, honestly, and the streaks were kind of like super high highs and like super low lows. This strat is all right, but there is something that came out of Settlers that is better, and that, of course, is going to be Pandemonium farming in T17 maps. The scarabs look something like this, and the Atlas tree looks something like this, but you have a lot of flexibility on the Atlas tree. There's not a whole lot contributing to it besides the quant and the effect of mods. The other stuff is just kind of whatever. Turns out Pandemonium is pretty good. This is what like a 6 to 8 hour session can net you in like an efficient 6-man. You see multiple T0s, tons of Dialas, all these valuable uniques. It is just the top dog in MFing and farming strategies for high-end groups and even solo MFers. But if you know anything about the Titanic scarab, you know you'll get into situations like this where you're attacking a boss with a multi-mirror build and his health bar just simply doesn't move.
His health literally won't move. It's over. What is this toughness scale? There's no way this is even correct. This has to be fucking bugged. How is this real toughness scaling? He literally takes no...
So you need some big boy builds to be able to do the hardest content with Titanic because the toughness scaling really just gets out of control. This has led to a lot of innovations that we've had to do in order to push out the damage necessary in order to be able to do the hardest Titanic content where you're doing Pandemonium and of Terrors so that you can kill all the map bosses in a short amount of time. And I think we have pushed the 6-man group to the absolute limit, and we have achieved a POB that can put out 5 trillion DPS. This version of the POB does have pretty good close to mirror tier gear, but it's all stuff that is very, very possible in a league. But let's not start there. Let's start with something that's probably a little bit more achievable on a league start. We have an early endgame version that has completely doable gear, and it's sitting right around 224 billion DPS. You do kind of need this much damage in order for 6-man Pandemonium with Delirium, etc. to feel comfortable. So previous builds, we were playing Bama, which does do good damage, but it does have kind of a ceiling. It's hard to scale out to the moon. And so group carries these days have been veering a little bit more towards armor stacking. Dreamfeather gives you increased attack damage per armor, and of course, if you're in a party, there are multiple ways to scale increased armor. You can scale increased evasion with Grace. There's a ton of avenues of scaling, and you can leverage other party members to shoot your armor into the moon, into the millions, and then you get a ton of percent increased damage, and the scaling on this just really goes out of control. So the name of the game, build a ton of armor. You need a source of flat, crit multi where you can, other multipliers where you can get it. It's pretty straightforward objective here. So how are the ways in which we're scaling a ton of increased armor to get 5 million? Well, first you have a juiced up Orbot, of course, giving you big grace, big determination, which we'll talk about in the next video. But for this character specifically, one of the big things that we're doing is using the amulet Untouched Soul. Untouched Soul seems innocuous at first because it gives you elemental resistance for each white socket. You can pair this with 2 items in the form of Formless Flame, which gives you armor per overcapped fire resistance, and a body armor perfect form or replica perfect form, which gives you evasion rating for overcapped cold resist. We're converting all of our evasion to armor, so both of these are contributing to our armor total. You get a ton of resistances from your party in the form of purities, from a war cry, from a censure of benevolence with linked flasks. You're getting a ton of resistances by having empty sockets, and you can make them white with blanching omens. And if you give a quick look at our increased armor, you can see that 640% of our 900% increased armor here is coming from Formless Flame. And then similarly with evasion, we're getting 607% from perfect form. So the 2 armors with overcapping res is an extremely good way to get a bunch of increased armor. And then our sources of flat come from a little bit on gear. We also have a juice determination, as I said before, and then a lot comes from a mana guardian that's giving us a lot of armor from reserving mana. And then of course, all of that armor gets multiplied by the more armor and more evasion from grace and determination. And So there's a lot of multipliers going on here, which contribute to the 5 million armor you can get on a low-end POB. Additionally, you are taking Supreme Ostentation on this jewel. This is the only node that this jewel has, so this is the only node that matters, really. And this allows you to tattoo off every single one of your attribute nodes for additional fire resistance for the strength, and then cold resistance for the dex. This is essentially just 6% increased armor for every single tattoo that you get here. All of that armor gives your replica Dream Feathers a whopping 11,000 increased damage per Dream Feather you have on, for a total increase of 22,000. On a high-end POB with max DPS, this can be more like 32,000% increased damage. So that's the main scalars of armor on the character. That's how you get all of your increased damage, but there's still a few other things you have to figure out on this build in order to get the huge numbers that you do. One of them is going to be flat damage is obviously missing, because on replica Dream Feathers, there really isn't a whole lot of damage here. One of them is penetration, which you can use Sap of the Seasons, which we'll explain a little bit later here. And the other one is, of course, going to be crit multi and attack speed. Those are the other things that this build is kind of missing. Berserker does help a lot on the attack speed front, and I think it is clearly the best ascendancy to be playing with the normal ascendancies, but I don't see a very compelling new ascendancy quite yet. So just know that Berserker is kind of the best stat stick for the ascendancy. There's nothing build enabling here about being a Berserker. You're just kind of choosing the best ascendancy that's kind of like offering the most stats in terms of like multi attack speed, this kind of thing. And Berserker just happens to do it best right now. But just know you can really play this on any ascendancy as long as the pathing is good on like Ranger, Duelist, or Shadow. The ascendancy doesn't really matter that much. Couple other things here. Our primary source of penetration on this build is going to be Sap of the Seasons, of course. I made a build video on why Sap of the Seasons is extremely broken. They have since capped this to 200% penetration, but 200% penetration is still a lot, and so you can still use the same concept as before, where you have a druggery support giving you a ton of recovery. Therefore, you can turn on Sap of the Seasons, and you can have in 200% penetration for free. Penetration also works with mechanics like inversion, and these two nodes together with Sap of the Season as well as the inversion kind of solve all of your penetration issues. It also lets you run a basically inordinate amount of plus monster elemental resistances on map mods. So if you get a map with like plus 200% elemental resistances, it doesn't really matter, because even if you assume the mob has 75% capped res, that penetration is only going to be penning against that 75 instead of the overcap. Whereas if you were to be using a curse, the curses would be eating into the overcap, and it makes curses significantly worse in this regard. This is kind of the reason why we have pivoted away from curse bot, because if a mob has 300% pseudo resistance, you have to reduce 300% resistance instead of starting at 75, which is what penetration does. And with Sap of the Seasons in the game combined with druggery, this is a super good combo, and it just solves the penetration issue completely. The one last thing that this build really needs to do is carry some amount of crit multi. We can see here from the calcs that we're getting a good amount of them from jewels. We have increased crit damage in links, and we have a few wheels on the tree. That's where the majority of our multi is coming from. So it is quite important to get some like pretty good multi jewels. If you could spend on like some triple multi jewels, this will go a long ways in increasing your damage. And then the last thing to talk about here is that on armor stackers, flask uptime is very imperative. On this early game POB of 224 billion DPS, you can turn off all the flasks, and you can easily see it goes down to 98 billion, which is a huge decrease in damage. This is why we equip Tides of Time, so we make sure that we have a pretty good uptime on our flasks, just because they are very important to boost our armor numbers and give us a ton of damage. You can later replace this with a Mage Blood, but I think Tides of Time is probably the best interim replacement until you get a Mage Blood. Now, on this early game POB, you do have to use returning projectiles, because we're assuming, of course, on an early game POB, you don't have Nimis. It's tough to estimate the damage on Nimis, because you're going to be either getting 2, maybe 3 returns, depending on like how much the mob is moving, but a best guess is you're going to be getting 2 hits here from a lightning strike on the return, and then 1 melee, and then you just have to make sure to reduce the damage on the return. I put this in the calcs if you're curious. Should be all in the config here. This is kind of where the build starts. I think all of these items are pretty reasonable for an early 6-man carry transition. None of these items are too expensive. I don't think. Maybe the Tides of Time is going to run you like 10 div is probably the most expensive item on here. Other than that, replica Dream Feather's pretty cheap. This Formless Flame is just useless 1C unique. This is also probably like a 2C unique. Southbound, of course, worthless. This rare boots is just res, chaos, res, life, and movement speed. And then you want chaos res to cap here. And you also want to be reflect immune on your rings. This is very, very important. This is your only source of reflect immunity. You aren't doing any kind of conversion on this build, so you do need to become Fizz reflect immune. You can get one ring, and then the mastery here will give you 100%. Even though you're doing primarily elemental damage from all of the supports that you're getting, you do a ton of physical damage here, over 1 million physical DPS here, so you will end up killing yourself if you don't have the Fizz reflect immunity. So from this early game POB, the next upgrade you're going to make, of course, is just going to be equipping a Nimbus. It's a very simple swap here. You just simply drop one ring, put on a Nimbus, drop the return projectiles and links for volatility support is the next best support here. This also lets you get full power on those returning projectiles. They no longer have a less damage multiplier on them. It's a huge, huge damage multiplier, and it basically doubles our damage. We go from 240 billion-ish to like 480 billion-ish. The pathing also changes a little bit. We want to prioritize a little bit more multi, so we're coming over here to get this last jewel socket. This allows us to pick up another multi-jewel, bumping up our multi to around 550% here. Additionally, it introduces the Jug node with Forbidden Flame and Flesh. This lets you get armor applies to chaos damage. This helps with your chaos mitigation. When you have 6 million armor, you probably don't need to have a ton of chaos res, so you can kind of sacrifice the chaos res a little bit on your gear, and then just take the Forbidden Flesh and Flame here, and this will do more than enough to help mitigate chaos damage in T17 maps. And then from here, of course, the next logical upgrade is going to be equipping a Mage Blood, putting on the Enkindling Orb for 70% effect on all of your flasks here. This does a ton for your damage here. You go to 700 billion at this point. As turns out, flasks really OP for giving yourself a ton of evasion and armor. It also helps a lot with your crit chance. It's a little bit hard to get crit capped on this build. The Diamond Flask is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, and we're also taking a few more rage nodes here. We're getting a lot of rage on hit on the tree, and so we have a lot of consistent rage generation. It's like about 5 per hit, and with these gear upgrades, you're sitting on about 8 million armor, 700 billion DPS, and then you can ascend to the final form. This is kind of a bit of a meme POB. It's just trying to see how far you can push the numbers, because you actually can't do this much damage in game. 5 trillion is not a possible number in PoE. The reason for that is your average hit is exceeding 2.147 billion, and so the calculations just start to break down. This build, if it could do this much damage per hit, would be doing 5 trillion DPS, but it's doing 28 billion per hit. The game cannot calculate that, and the game just starts breaking down when you have this much damage. Like, the hits aren't registering, you do 0 damage. Like, the game just doesn't work when you're overflowing the damage. But we sacked all of our chaos res, we put on as much crit multi-jewels as we can, and we equipped some mirror items just to see how far we could push the build. The uniques are still unbeatable here. We have perfect form and we have formless flame. The amount of increased armor you get here is just unmatched. And the main things we're doing is we're just getting some action speed and some, giga boots here with some tailwind, just a ton of action speed. We have a simplex amulet giving us a fuck ton of crit, and then increased elemental resistances, which is also increasing our armor. And then we have another ring that's just giving us a fuck ton of multi attack speed and elemental resistances for even more armor. You can see that multi is the biggest scaler here, and so the mirror items that you can go for, the GG items you can go for, are all going to be the big crit multi pieces here. It also drops a little bit of life on the tree to pick up another rage wheel, which obviously probably isn't a very good idea, but if you want to juice the numbers, this is kind of what you can be doing. This build is completely possible. All of these items did exist in Necro Settlers and in Settlers, but you obviously wouldn't compromise the defenses of a character in 6-man like this. You don't want to die, you don't want to break the map, so it's just a fun experiment of what you can do in PoB. And of course, we're swapping the Forbidden Flesh and Flame away from our Chaos Resistance node over to the last Berserker node, just because it is more damage for more rage effect. If you can somehow activate the Cry, the Vengeful Cry on the Cry bot, this can be even more. I didn't put it on this PoB, but you can cast Vengeful Cry for even more rage, which is multiplying against the Berserker node here. It just gets out of control. I think with some more optimizations, you could even push this like 6, 7, 8 trillion if you're doing some like more rage stacking memes, but I'm just leaving it here if you want to look at potentially where you can take the build high end. Anyways, now I hope you have a little bit of a better grasp on what armor stacking carries should be looking to do and kind of why they're necessary in 6-man. It's just because you need so much damage, the single target matters so much, and groups are kind of moving towards armor stacker because all the content is revolving around the Titanic scarab, so single target is king, T17 damage is king. You don't necessarily need the clear speed, so lightning strike, armor stacker is kind of the direction everything's going. I'm gonna make a few more videos updating some of the prior builds. We've had some new innovations in the Kohler as well as the miner support, and some new innovations on the Orbot that are all kind of enabling this character to function, but those all kind of deserve their own video because there's been a lot of stuff that's changed in group party play and PoE. I'm gonna make videos videos on all of the supports and basically their core function. And then also I kind of want to talk about how they will be able to be adapted into these new ascendancies for this 1 month long event. So yeah, keep a lookout for the other videos. I'm gonna try and go over all the supports and that kind of thing a little bit more in depth for you guys. If you have any questions, you want to leave in the comments. And once again, I'm Snap, and thanks for watching.